The so-called Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has claimed that in her first 200 days as secretary, the US has seen a decline of approximately 1.6 million undocumented immigrants across the country. This figure could not be independently verified, but if even half of that number is true, it represents a significant targeted cleansing of non-white ethnicity from American soil. The Trump regime said last week it is reviewing more than 55 million people who have valid US visas for any violations that could lead to deportation, which can include tourists from many countries who are subject to continuous vetting, with an eye toward any indication they could be ineligible for permission to enter or stay in the United States, meaning if they are anti-Trump. Should such information be found, the visa will be revoked, and if the visa holder is in the United States, he or she would be subject to deportation, the regime said. Meanwhile, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a 30-year-old Salvadorian immigrant, is once again in the custody of U.S. immigration authorities. This morning, he walked into an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in Baltimore, expecting a routine check-in. Instead, just 3 days after being released from detention in Tennessee, he was handcuffed and taken away. His attorneys and supporters say his case has become the latest example of how the Trump regime is twisting immigration enforcement into a tool of political blackmail. Abrego's story begins more than a decade ago when, as a teenager, he fled El Salvador to escape gang violence. He entered the United States without papers in 2011 and eventually built a life in Maryland, working as a sheet metal apprentice. For years, he was protected by a federal court order that barred his deportation to El Salvador, recognizing the danger he faced if returned. That safeguard collapsed earlier this year. In March, despite the order, immigration authorities deported him back to El Salvador. Officials later admitted it was an administrative error. The consequences, however, were anything but administrative. Abrego was locked inside El Salvador's notorious terrorism confinement center, known as CCOT. According to legal filings, he was tortured physically and psychologically while held there. His family feared they may never see him alive again. After months of pressure from human rights groups, faith leaders, and even a Supreme Court order, the regime relented. In June, Abrego was returned to the United States, but rather than correcting their mistake, officials randomly charged him with human smuggling. His attorneys call the accusations baseless, pointing out that prosecutors have produced no credible evidence. His trial is scheduled for January. Then came the offer. According to court filings, the government approached Abrego with a deal. If he pleaded guilty to the smuggling charge, which they made up, and agreed to remain in jail, he could be deported to Costa Rica. Unlike El Salvador, Costa Rica was willing to recognize him as a refugee. In other words, his safety was conditional on admitting to a crime he insists he did not commit. When he refused, the government switched tactics and moved to send him to Uganda, a country with which he has no ties, and one the State Department itself describes as plagued by unlawful killings, torture, and arbitrary detention. Simon Sandoval-Moschenberg, one of Abrego's attorneys, described the maneuver bluntly. They are holding Costa Rica as a carrot and using Uganda as a stick to force him to confess to a crime he did not commit. This is not law enforcement, this is blackmail, he said outside the ICE office today. This morning, Abrego also filed a lawsuit demanding that he not be deported until he's been given full due process in US courts, something the Trump regime claims is not necessary. Supporters had gathered to rally on his behalf. Activists and clergy sang hymns and chanted "We are Kilmar" before entering the building. Abrego addressed the crowd in Spanish through a translator. He thanked them for marching, praying, and raising their voices. "Remember that I was free and I was able to be reunited with my family. This was a miracle," he said. But soon after he disappeared inside the building, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem issued a statement. She confirmed that Abrego was being processed for deportation, but did not say to which country. She also repeated a series of lies against him. President Trump, she said, is not going to allow this illegal alien, who is an MS-13 gang member, human trafficker, serial domestic abuser, and child predator, to terrorize American citizens any longer. None of these claims have been substantiated, and his family has consistently denied them. His lawyers note that branding him with every imaginable label is part of the government's strategy to justify punishing a man who refuses to plead guilty. The case has drawn outrage from political leaders as well as activists. Glenn Ivey, the Democratic congressman representing the Maryland district where Abrego's family lives, called his detention a total abuse of power. He accused the administration of trying to avoid embarrassment in court. They know they don't have the goods. They don't have the evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, Ivey said, referring to the pending criminal trial in Tennessee. For Ivey, the controversy is not confined to Washington or the courts. He said Abrego's case has cut through the political noise and stirred his constituents in ways few issues do. Many residents, he said, were shaken earlier this year when Trump hosted Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele in the Oval Office. During that meeting, Trump suggested that so-called homegrown criminals from the United States could be deported to El Salvador. I think folks know that that could be us, Ivey said, and so we need to nip this in the bud as fast as possible. What is at stake, advocates argue, goes beyond one man's fate. The pattern is becoming clear. Wrongfully deport someone, bring them back under pressure, charge them with a crime, then use the threat of banishment to a dangerous third country as leverage to secure a guilty plea. It is a strategy that strips due process from immigrants and allows the regime to present deportations as victories in its war on so-called illegals. Observers say Abrego's ordeal may represent something even larger. It appears to be a test case for policies, the sweeping far-right Christian nationalist blueprint for a future Trump presidency. That plan calls for expanding deportation powers and using them aggressively, even against people without criminal convictions. Critics warn that the goal is not simply to enforce the law, but to engineer demographic change by driving out non-white immigrants and reshaping America into what one advocate called a white-only fortress. Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case now hangs in the balance. His attorneys will continue to fight in court, his family will continue to plead his innocence, and his supporters will continue to rally outside ICE offices. But the broader question remains: is this a single wrongful deportation, or is it the opening act of a much wider campaign to punish immigrants on false grounds and to make America white again under the direction of the Heritage Foundation? I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.